Grad school has allowed me to build an experimental practice. I came into this program 2 years ago without a specific area of study, but rather a desire to experiment and explore the design process without concern for the outcome. I've spent the past 2 years investigating different objects and industries through the lens of design in order to better understand my own practice as a designer. This semester, I began by taking an in-depth look at the lumber industry. My dad has worked in the lumber industry for over 40 years. My grandfather worked in a sawmill, as did both of my great-grandparents. This area of inquiry is part of my heritage, but I've always felt a disconnect between the work I do and the work my dad does. I've realized over the past few months that my work this semester is an exploration of that gap. The work I'm about to share can be categorized as a series of experiments, each of them looking at wood from a different perspective. I began by taking a tour of the sawmill with my dad. One of the first thoughts that struck me when we drove into the plant was the sheer magnitude of the operation. The processing of timber to lumber was incredibly regimented, breaking down organic matter into solid geometric shapes. The plant is also resourceful, utilizing every part of the trees they harvest. Here, a specific group of logs was set aside because metal was detected within them. My dad later showed me this image of a spike that had run undetected through the planer. I learned that this was called tree spiking, a process meant to render the log unusable. This was a different relationship between wood and metal than I was used to seeing. Usually wood was cutting metal, or metal was holding wood together. Here, the wood seemed to grow around the metal, holding it in place. In addition to the relationship between wood and metal, I was also curious about the juxtaposition between old and new wood. One of my first 3D projects this semester was the deconstruction of an antique window frame. In comparing it to this IKEA picture frame, I learned the concept of upgrading wood. It's a practice that removes knots or imperfections from a piece of wood, like you see here, eventually finger joining the pieces back together. The wood is considered stronger and thus more valuable. I wondered what would happen if I applied that concept to the window frame, removing the dry rotted pieces and replacing them with a piece of new wood. I did exactly that, but the final product only posed more questions. There was a clear division between old and new wood, but why did I create an exact replica? Could I have learned more if I went with a different style or scale? And despite my best efforts to replicate, there was a clear misalignment between the two pieces. Misalignment and tension were reoccurring themes in my work this year, particularly with wood. Deconstructing objects in 3D, be it windows, picture frames, wood type, made me more aware of their volume, shape, and dimension. One such example is my experiment with wood type. I began by physically cutting up this A to experiment with. Those images were underwhelming, but made me curious to replicate this process in 2D. Here, I collaged photographs of the letter I had taken at slightly different angles. The misalignment reads as a multidimensional object. As a viewer, it was disorienting. As a designer, it made me think about 2D perspective differently. I first began experimenting with material collages 5 weeks into the semester. At the time, I was looking for a way to link my seemingly disparate projects together. I had spent weeks gathering and looking at material, wood samples, letters, logs, and cut lumber. It was only after seeing work by German photographer MegQuarton, seen quickly here, that I realized how I might bring it all together. Parton's images often focused on visual similarity, producing a feeling of tension and unrest as the eye didn't know where to focus. I tried to work similarly, combining objects physically and trying to eliminate shadow in order to question depth, perspective, and scale. I called these studies material collages. This was the first introduction of color gels. In a way, it felt like cheating. My project was about wood. But I'm beginning to understand the value of calling these moments of doubt into question. It allows me to reevaluate my process and challenge my parameters. I began to shoot images only with color gels and combine them digitally with the material studies. The color felt like a missing element. With them, compositions began to form more organically. I shared these with a classmate, and she pointed out that there was a beautiful juxtaposition happening of how I saw wood as a designer compared to how my dad viewed it as someone who worked in lumber. During this time, I also began another 3D project, the IKEA dresser. It was meant to be a quick study to replace the time and labor-intensive window frame. However, the dresser was not without its own lessons. My goal was simple, to illustrate the concept of upgrading wood by removing the knots. Though the deconstruction and removal was straightforward, the reassembly process was not. With every cut I made on the table saw, a 1/16 of an inch was removed. The entire piece was misaligned. I assembled what I could, but honestly was more interested in this process than I was putting together a finished dresser. I wondered how I might incorporate elements of this experience, physical or digital, into my collage work. I continued to work on my studies in 2D. In an effort to go larger, I broke the images down further, so they showed only hints of their true selves. One week, I printed out the series so I could see them on the wall. A what-if question of placement led me to pin this image in the corner, which reminded me of the digital wood type explorations I'd done. Suddenly, I felt as if I was looking in on the wall. I wondered how I could expand on this process in 3D. I percolated on this idea and continued to work on developing the images in 2D. Through subtle refinement, I was able to create this series of images. I shared them with my photography instructor recently, and he commented that the most successful images for him were the ones that struck a balance between photography and design. That the composition was successful when the 4x6 grid seemed to fade away. I kept this in mind as I continued to work both in 2D and 3D. Through some trial and error, I was able to translate my digital method of working to the physical world. Working physically posed different challenges. It required much more space. I was constantly looking over at my work from different angles and distances. I spread out images on the ground, and I understood how the element of chance was greater. Overlap was everywhere, and even as I worked on the board, images slipped in ways I hadn't intended, but seemed to fit nonetheless. It was a slower process, but eventually the shapes started to emerge. I remembered what my photography instructor had said about an image being successful when the 4x6 grid seemed to fade away. This was a good test run, but there are elements in past collages that are missing from this one, such as a background to build from and images of different scales. The smaller piece of wood gets lost among the images, which makes me wonder how I can incorporate stronger elements of sculpture into these experiments. I also wonder how to approach balance in such a large composition. I'd like to see this 3D installation refined further, hopefully addressing some of these comments. While the IKEA dresser and the window frame feel like more open-ended questions, their experiences have informed my collage work. That series of work I plan to continue expanding and exploring, with a specific focus on the balance of the images as seen between photography and design. As I stated at the beginning of this video, this program has allowed me to build an experimental practice. As a designer, I feel more confident trusting my observations and asking questions to further my research and methodology. Thank you.